Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
Hey, just was wondering, is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?
Yeah, I got fresh memes hot off the grill, tasty and delicious, because we're jumping into Diablo this time when it comes to the custom card review, and we got 10 custom cards from you guys, the RegisKillbin community, if you will, and some pretty neat stuff here, specifically focused on the evil side of Diablo, so we can save things like the angels and Nephilim. That said, let's go ahead and jump into these cards. And I'm going to start off with a controversial one, I'm sure. This is Prime Evil Tatha for Mr. Geddes, a 6-mana 6/6 demon for Warlock. Legendary, of course, and start of game reads, replace your starting hand with copies of Hellfire. And I'm sure all the start of game haters out there and the Trump custom card watchers will immediately cry foul for this card, but hear me out and let's talk about it, right? So as a minion, this is just a 6-mana 6/6, very bad. So all the value in running this card in your deck is tied into this start of game effect. So the question is this effect actually good? And if you look at Hearthstone, you're basically getting here 3 to 4 Hellfires added to your early hand. You could maybe even run some more Hellfires in your deck on top of that. So something like 5 to 6 Hellfires in your deck for a total of 5 to 6 nice little board clears, but also, you know, something like 15 to 18 damage as well. So you could see two ways to use a card like this. One, just giving you all the answers to things like Zoo and Murloc Shaman decks, just clearing their board after turn 4 time after time after time. But remember, that means for 3 turns, you're not doing anything. So you're actually kind of passing a lot of early game tempo unless you can draw into the right things or maybe life tap into a nice answer. But again, that's even more damage you're taking against these aggro decks. So using this as sort of an anti-aggro tool comes with a lot of its own risks, because you might just die and you'd be hurting yourself with all these Hellfires, just accelerating your demise. So I don't really know if that's a game plan that works. Maybe there are certain builds that could utilize it, but I think it'd be tough. Alternatively, maybe the scarier way to use this is as a card that adds a lot of burst damage to your hand. If you're running a deck that just has a lot of spell damage, has some minions that can get out and aggressive, charge minions, those sorts of things, you might just be able to run over your opponent and do a lot of burst damage. But I like that theoretically this could go in 2 different ways, and I'm not really sure it's great in either, but there could be some deck out there that uses this. Plus, I just love the idea of this like chaotic evil card that is just wreaking havoc with multiple Hellfires. It's obviously incredibly fitting thematically for Diablo-style cards, and this dude's like the biggest, baddest Diablo originator there is, so a good fit for him too. Up next here we have Leoric, the Undying from Waking Mars, another Warlock card, as there are going to be a lot in this video because Warlock seems like the evil demon class, right? Leoric here, a 5/5. I don't know if he should really be classified as a demon or not, but works for me. Death Rattle reads, go dormant, and then after an adjacent demon dies, this awakens. And if you're familiar with Leoric at all, he's a dude that just keeps coming back to life, particularly in Here's the Storm, a game I play a lot. That's kind of his trait. He just doesn't die for long. He's just immediately popping back up on the battlefield, and that's precisely what this minion does as well. But it is a really slow 9-mana 5/5, right? So it's this guy you can keep bringing back to life in the late game. So it's kind of like, you know, a Dread Steed essentially, but conditional and way late in the game, which might sound like a problem, right? Like, oh man, that's just too slow. Like, that's never going to matter. But if you think about this in a deck that can cheat out things through, like, for instance, a 6-mana Dr. Morrigan that's being buffed and put into Hearthstone, then sure, getting this out early would be nice. And if you can keep a demon train going, 5/5 that just keeps returning into play could be really powerful in a grindy style deck like that, almost like an infinite minion death rattle based Warlock deck. So I don't think this card looks immediately like crazy powerful or strong. I think it looks a little slow and a little conditional, but when I start grinding the gears a little bit, I'm sure there's some deck that just likes that inevitability and sort of infinite nature of something like this. Wild format in particular, you could really pull off some shenanigans with this card with things like N'Zoth, or, you know, maybe even like discard Warlock with demons that keep hitting the board and taking trades from the Lakari Sacrifice Portal. So a card that's probably not going to like light the meta on fire, but a fun one that exists and captures the character really well. So in my mind, still a great design. Up next here, we have Belial, Lord of Lies from Sleepy Kitty Aura. And this dude's the kind of trickster evil, and 8 mana 5/4 for Rogue, thankfully. And the battle cry reads, add 5 different secrets from another class to your hand. So we have here a card that kind of reminds me of something like Subject 9, right? Mid-sized body that puts a bunch of secrets into your hand. But Belial is 8 mana instead, so much slower, but you're also getting 5 secrets from another class. So non-rogue secrets, you're looking at Paladin, Mage, and Hunter, of course. And on average, that's just a lot of value. On average, you're getting a 2 mana spell, so that's like 10 mana in value added to your hand. Plus, it's like super unpredictable for your opponent. So it's one of those things where it's like, man, I just don't know what to do. Now, unfortunately, Paladin secrets aren't great on average, so some of those might low roll, but some Mage secrets could be amazing. Beyond that, with battle cry synergies that exist in Rogue, you could add like 10 secrets to your hand, and you're just generating ridiculous amounts of value. Bouncing this thing back to your hand could be powerful. So, although I would probably personally make this card just a little bit cheaper, even though it is generating a lot of stuff, I think it's still a very interesting design and fitting for the character, certainly, like a really secretive, tricksy kind of character. This is exactly what they do. They'd always be tricking you and lying to you, and I think it'd be very fun to play and a little bit frustrating to play against, but in a rewarding sort of way. So a card like this, even though I tweaked the balance a tad myself, still a fantastic design that would fit in Hearthstone nicely. Moving on here, we have the Butcher from Cluckerduck, a 9 mana 4/4 demon for Warrior this time. And the battle cry reads, destroy a minion and gain its stats. So a lot of people submitted Butcher cards, and a lot of them had these really complex mechanics where Butcher would like kill something or hook something and like eat the meat of it, which is a Butcher mechanic. He likes going around and collecting meat to basically heal himself. I thought Cluckerduck kind of captured that idea in a very Hearthstone-esque way, which is in a sort of sideways direction. A lot of the times, cards we see in Hearthstone from the design team will sort of only barely capture a mechanic or really condense it and simplify it down, because a lot of people would have like 3 or 4 tokens and all these little things happening that got really complex that didn't feel quite as Hearthstone-y to me, even though they might have captured the theme of the character perfectly or the fantasy of the Butcher really nicely. This one boiled it down into the essence. So really the Butcher here is still killing something and he's kind of eating it or consuming it to make himself stronger. It's just like, 5 or 6 words instead of like 4 different token cards achieving that same kind of effect. Now, this does remind me a little bit of like Blade of Cthulhu for Rogue way back in the day. They would add stats to Cthulhu, but instead for the Butcher, it's happening immediately. So you've got this really swingy card that could do some crazy stuff if your opponent doesn't have the return swing for it, but it is slow, so it stays in check. If you think about like Vile Spine Slayers, for instance, very powerful card. This one comes much later in the game, but it's a much bigger threat on the return. So I think it feels balanced. It might even honestly could be a little bit cheaper if you think about it. It's not as good as something like Mind Control in a lot of ways. It's better in others, but it doesn't have the silence effect of a Mind Control, so it's not nearly as good against like Death Rattles, for instance. So I think the cost and effect feel pretty good, as far as I'm concerned, this looks like a very realistic Hearthstone card to me. Moving on here, I have a card I think some of you are probably going to criticize as being a little bit too simplistic, and I think that's a fair comment. But I will counter that I think it's really elegant instead and referential in a really good way. And again, a card that feels very realistic to Hearthstone. This is Duriel, Lord of Pain, a pain-focused demon in Diablo. 6 mana, 3/9. It is, of course, a demon, neutral minion, and it reads, whenever this minion takes damage, draw a card. And astute observers out there will notice that's the exact same effect as Acolyte of Pain, but Duriel, Lord of Pain, is way bigger than Acolyte of Pain because he's the Lord of Pain. Acolyte is like training to be an Acolyte of Duriel. So we've got here a card that just multiplies Acolyte times 3, but only multiplying the cost by 2, so it looks like a much more efficient way to do it. And although this effect is simplistic, and it may not necessarily feel legendary, but you consider the stat line here, I think this card's really intriguing, because some classes and decks could use this in a really interesting way. Think about like Defile, Warlock, and Wild, for instance. Maybe drawing 4 or 5 cards or something off of Duriel would be a really neat combo. Warriors could use this pretty well too in Whirlwind-style decks. So even though it's just a straight transformation of another card and it's kind of based on a pun, I think that multiplying those numbers so significantly really does change how impactful this card could be and how good it is. Plus, it just tells a neat little story between those 2 cards. So I think Faroon here did a great job. Simple job, certainly, but a great job translating this character into something that works nicely in Hearthstone. Moving on here to Azmodan, Lord of Sin from Weird Grim. This is a 7-mana 5/9 neutral legendary. And the battle cry reads, double the portals in your deck, upgrade all your portals into 5/5 demons with Rush. So we have here, Azmodan is a guy who really likes summoning demons from portals, so a perfect fit here is a follow-up to the portal-style cards we got already in Rise of Shadows, things like Portal Overfiend, that so far haven't really made a lot of sense, even in like plot twist decks, but something like Azmodan would really pull that mechanic together and give you much higher impact from your portals, because first off, you get twice as many, so you're twice as likely to draw one in any given instance. Also, they're 5/5s now instead of 2/2s, so they take much better trades. And because we've seen those cards be fairly unimpactful now, I think this is okay. Like, yes, it looks strong, and yes, getting like 5/5s out of your deck with Rush is really powerful and significantly better than things like Falderai Strider for Rogue. It's still a legendary card, so it's a one-of in your deck. You're not always going to have it. You have to line things up in specific sorts of certain kinds of orders. And we already know that it's not a really strong mechanic on its own as of yet. So to me, even though it's very powerful, I think it would be a fine follow-up, and it might actually enable a plot twist deck to exist, which so far I don't think the rewards for plot twist are there. A card like this would really help solve that problem, and it's of course very befitting for the character as well. So I think Weird Grim did a great job here with Azmodan, the Lord of Sin. Up next here we have Andariel, Maiden of Anguish for Mr. Geddes, a 5-mana 0/8 rogue minion. Big health total there, but 0 attack. But it reads, after your hero attacks, gain attack equal to your weapon's attack. Attack, 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 attack. This is basically a super big Hinch Clan thug, right? That starts out as a completely useless threat, but in a weapon deck with a big weapon that you're attacking with repeatedly, a card like this could snowball into a giant threat. So if you have a 4 or 5 attack weapon on turn 4, this already becomes a 5-mana 4/8 almost immediately. And although susceptible to silence, that's a pretty meaty minion to play on turn 5 that becomes a really big threat, because if you follow it up again with another 4 attack weapon, it goes up to an 8/8 minion for 5 mana. But there's really a little bit of downside here to keep this in check, and it comes much later in the game than something like Hinch Clan Thug, and it doesn't gain health. So still very susceptible to early or single target removal in that mid-game scenario. There's a lot of that stuff that exists, and although the snowball's there, I think it's a little bit more easy to counter. So in other words, I think a far less oppressive card than something like Hinch Clan Thug, because that can really snowball so fast, so early, which we saw a lot in the past with Odd Rogue, but still a card that preserves the threat nature, and it synergizes really nicely with weapon decks. We don't have that many great follow-up cards for Rogue weapon decks these days, particularly with Raiding Party and Wagglepick nerfed and No Dread Corsair. So something like this that creates a way to utilize your weapons in a powerful way and maybe encourages weapon buffs like Deadly Poison, Tinker Sharpsword Oil in wild format would be a really cool threat to play in an aggressive minion-based rogue deck. So for me, I think it's a cool card. Up next here from Imaginary MDA, another version of Azmodan, Lord of Sin, another Warlock card, 6 mana 6/6 this time. Battlecry reads, discard a card and then deal damage equal to its cost to all enemies. So not just enemy minions, but all enemies. And I love this style of discard card, because usually when you have a discard synergy card, it's like the outcome of the discard is really binary. It's like, oh, I discarded something I didn't need, and that's awesome, or I discarded something really good, and I'm sad about it. So, back in the day, you'd be happy to discard like a 1-mana card, but you wouldn't want to discard your 10-mana Blood Reaver Gul'dan, for instance, right? And it felt really good or really bad. With something like Azmodan, Lord of Sin, you've got here a card that, first off, doesn't really have to rely on other discard synergies to be relevant, because it is just a nice board clear. And beyond that, the result of the discard is kind of commensurate with the card being discarded. So sometimes actually discarding a 10-mana card might be amazing, because you get a full board clear and you pyroblast your opponent in the face. And then, discarding a 5-mana card, maybe it's middle ground, you feel pretty good because you flame strike the board and you didn't lose anything super important. And then, for a 1-mana card or something low cost, like, yeah, you're sad you didn't do a lot to the board, but you also didn't lose a great resource in the process. So there's kind of a hierarchy of results here, and it's not awful at any given scenario outside of maybe one specific card you're looking to lose. And I really like that aspect of it, because that makes discard feel less bad, which is one thing that always sucked about discard, is how often it would just result in something miserable feeling. So not only a card with a powerful outcome here that's self-sufficient, but also does discard in a way that I think not many other cards have done in the past, and something that I appreciate a lot. So cool spin on discard mechanics here from Imaginary MDA. Up next here we have Mephisto, Lord of Hatred from Vesu, a 6-mana 3/3 demon for Warlock. Battlecry, deal 2 damage to all other minions, no matter where they are. Now, we have seen something very similar to this design long ago in the custom card review, but I thought this brought it back in an interesting way, attaching it to a minion. And I love this style effect because it has so many interesting applications in Hearthstone, right? So you're going to be dealing damage to your opponent's minions in their deck. So if they're running a bunch of knife jugglers and evil geniuses in a zoo deck, you're just killing those when you play Mephisto, Lord of Hatred, often removing maybe like 5 low-cost cards, 10 low-cost cards in their deck, and that can be good because you kill a lot of their aggressive stuff, but alternatively that can be bad because you filter out their deck of low-cost cards, then they're going to draw like their arch-villain Rafam or whatever big threat they're waiting for, Sea Giants. So it can be good, but it can also backfire. It can be a great onboard clear, but it can have negative results in the deck. And depending on the game state, the scenario, the matchup, this card can either be incredibly amazing or really risky. And often there's a risk-reward calculation happening, like it's really good on board, but maybe it's bad for the overall game state. And I love cards that create those sort of frictions where you have to make very powerful and important decisions. So although a lot of people would freak out and say, this card's too amazing, Regis, don't forget all the downsides. You're also dealing damage to your own minions in your deck. And maybe there are some ways to utilize that, but in other cases it might be really bad. And it limits your deck building, and you can't put in certain things if you need them. You could also use it to thin out your own deck. So there's just like 47 different ways to consider how this card's going to impact the outcome of the game. And I absolutely love that. So I think this is a perfect card design. I'd love to see something like this in Hearthstone. And then finally, we have one hero card here making the cut. I saved Diablo for the very end. From Elandre, this is an 8-mana hero card. Battlecry reads, for the rest of the game, all minions lose Rush and Charge. And although I think Rush and Charge should probably have been capitalized and bolded there, I'm willing to overlook it for the sake of a pretty neat hero card design here, I think. We also have the hero power called Terror, 2 mana, return a random enemy minion to your opponent's deck. So first off, great name there on the hero power. It's like the opponent's minions are so scared. One of them is just so terrified of Diablo because he is the Lord of Terror that they're like fleeing back to the hand. That's really good flavor. It's also just a random sap on a hero power, which is really rather powerful. Now, the fact that it's random is one limitation for it, but still often you'd be sapping a lot of good things for your opponent. So pretty strong hero power, but arguably the hero card itself in the battle right here, not as good, particularly in certain matchups. It might just not matter at all, right? But in others, it's going to be amazing. Think about, for instance, against Dr. Boom Mad Genius. I love this as an answer to Dr. Boom Mad Genius because the Rush mechs no longer have Rush. And that's amazing because they're really the most powerful part of Dr. Boom Mad Genius and mech warrior builds in general. So this would be the perfect way to address that, as long as you're able to take sort of an 8-mana pass turn where you only get 5 mana, which isn't always going to be easy. Now, keep in mind the flavor on this Battlecry is perfect too. Minions are so scared of Diablo that they're unwilling to like charge or rush at him. They're kind of cowering on the battlefield, and they need a moment to get their wits about them. So I think this is an absolute flavor home run for the character. I think it's a really important mechanic to exist in Hearthstone. And although this hero power scares me a little bit too, because I think it might be a tad too powerful, I think it's okay because it's not infinite value generating or anything of the sort that just completely snowballs. It still has limitations in late game scenarios, and it's a pretty slow sort of hero card in and of itself too. So I think there is a bit of a counterbalance there that keeps it in check. That said, as always, I'm curious to hear what you guys think here about Diablo, Lord of Terror, and all other 9 cards in this video. That said, that wraps it up for this custom card review. Memeing on Diablo. We'll do more Diablo stuff in the future for the Angels and maybe the Nephilim. Those are pretty fun things in the Blizzard universe here. But next time we're going to change it back to Hearthstone-themed designs. And specifically this time, it has to be around stealth. It presumably will be a stealth minion most of the time, but if you have a card that does something like a weapon or a spell related to stealth, feel free to toss that into. I just want a card that utilizes the keyword stealth in some way or another, and hopefully in a really cool and creative way. And of course, you can find all the details on submitting your card next time in the description below. But until then, thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.